Hello everyone and welcome to this presentation on the marginalisation of the Indigenous LGBTI population. Today I will discuss the ways that Indigenous LGBTI groups experience disproportionate discrimination in society compared to non-Indigenous people, how this affects their social, cultural and emotional well-being, and in turn, how they struggle to enjoy their human rights. To begin, I would like to take the time to respectfully acknowledge the Yugambeh people, the traditional owners of the land on which I live, and pay my respect to their elders and descendants past and present. I also acknowledge the many Aboriginal people from other regions as well as Torres Strait and South Sea Islander people who now live in the local community. I would also like to pre-warn Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers that the following presentation may contain images of deceased peoples. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to the Indigenous Australian population as a whole, but I want to emphasise the importance of the diversity that exists among Indigenous people and that not all experiences will be the same. We must also be mindful of the ongoing histories which we're all a part of in Australia, which involve colonialisation, privilege and oppression, and always consider the intersections of race, sexuality, gender and class. When we erase these issues, we allow for the erasure of history, which in turn prevents many Aboriginal people from fulfilling their rights, claims, identities and interests. This also applies to the LGBTI population, which includes people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and intersex, alternative gender identities and sexual orientations, or anyone who otherwise may not conform to the traditional gender binaries or normative sexual orientations. Although these people may share disparities among themselves, they are a diverse group which exists across many different locales and times. The struggle for the Indigenous LGBTI rights is entwined between overcoming racial discrimination while gaining social acceptance for all gender identities and sexual orientations. This makes the group unique and complex, as solutions must target both issues simultaneously and ensure that people receive equal individual human rights, including the dignity of the individual, personal freedom and bodily autonomy. The empowerment of the LGBTI identities also works to decolonialise the harm caused to the communities, as they no longer perform in accordance to the ruling class, but rather to appease their own individual and cultural identities. LGBTI Indigenous Australians are at a higher risk than their non-Indigenous and non-queer counterparts, as they are likely to face intersecting points of discrimination and marginalisation against both their race and sexual orientation or gender identities on a structural, institutional and interpersonal level. Public health professionals have long recognised the role of these acts of discrimination when it comes to the production and maintenance of health disparities in marginalised groups. Health problems that Indigenous LGBTI people are more likely to suffer include high rates of suicide, self-harm and mental illnesses, high risks of being victim to violence and sexual assault, high rates of HIV and AIDS, low self-esteem and suppressed identities, among many other things. Feelings of purposelessness can also lead to destructive behaviour, difficulties with relationships and substance abuse and violence. One of the biggest problems is a lack of access to support, such as health centres, as people who live in regional and rural areas are excluded from mainstream health programs. Aboriginal medical services in rural areas are not equipped to deal with gender issues. For example, there is no access to hormone treatment for transgender patients. Women's shelters are also uninformed and may reject trans women. Furthermore, in small communities, there is a risk of people outing themselves to people before they're ready to come out, which could be detrimental if it was not deemed acceptable in the family or community. The lack of autonomy in these scenarios can also lead to people not feeling safe in their communities, especially if there is a risk of being outed to people who may cause them harm. Some researchers have even found that gay-related stresses, such as coming out to a parent or peer harassment, were associated with suicidal feelings and suicide attempts. The wider effect of this is that people's mental and physical health may deteriorate because of a lack of attending health institutions. Overall, the treatment and non-acceptance of Indigenous LGBT community causes great harms and threats of harm to the community, suppresses their identities, and evokes feelings of displacement. The way we traditionally perceive gender, that is, with the binary of male masculine and female feminine, and the normalised sexual orientation of heterosexuality, has the power to marginalise a significant portion of identities in society who may not conform to these ideas. Patriarchal systems also work to strengthen male superiority, assign roles, set boundaries, and shape society into rigid gendered categories, which includes our identities. Aboriginal understandings of gender are often not as rigid, though. Gender is simply not equated with biology, although it is a significant factor in determining linguistic categories of feminine or masculine. However, qualities that reside within the ideas of feminine and masculine are equally admired across the sexes. Gendered traits are seen not as contrastive axes, but as shared attributes that any person can hold. For example, qualities such as physical strength and hardness are equally admired in women and men in Aboriginal society. Linguistic studies also show that gendered language is used for animals, inanimate objects, rituals, and occurrences such as weather events. But while these non-human groups are usually assigned gender binaries of male and female, human groups are the only group which regularly bear pluralistic gendered language in the majority of the first Australian languages. By examining these Aboriginal concepts of gender regarding nature, the bodily physicality, and individuality, we can extend our understanding of the nature of gender concepts in Aboriginal society. Therefore, we can consider if early Aboriginal societies were more accepting of people showing both masculine and feminine traits, they may also have been less likely to label someone as other for forming an identity around something alternative. For example, transgender people have been a part of Aboriginal culture long before the European invasion. They're usually known as sister girls or brother boys, and they gave themselves the name sister girls because they see themselves as girls trapped in a male body, and they treat each other like sisters with a sisterhood-like bond. Once a reference solely for transgender Aboriginal people, sister girls has now been used to more widely describe those who are queer. Sister girls and brother boys have distinct cultural identities and roles and live their lives otherwise as if they were born as their chosen gender and take on traditional gendered cultural practices. Despite this more fluid understanding of gender, some discrimination against the LGBTI plus community does occur. Some sister girls tell family stories of violence and suicide among their community, where the dead were denied traditional death rights. In remote, more traditional Aboriginal communities, being LGBTI often means going against strictly observed and held cultural practices and religious beliefs. For example, it is still highly frowned upon for a brother boy to play didgeridoo as they are born female. Coming out is a huge life event for anyone in the LGBTI community, but even more difficult for Aboriginal transgender people. Colonialism has a lot of historical harm to account for, including the way it has influenced gender and sexual orientation relations in the Indigenous culture. Indigenous males and female identities were constantly being redefined in relation to one another in order to conform to the traditional binaries. People were essentially forced to perform their genders in the context of an entirely new society. Troy Anthony Bayliss of the Jawoyn Nation says that there is little specific queer sexuality recorded in Indigenous history, perhaps as a result of colonialisation, which silenced that kind of expression and behaviour. Aboriginal people hid or suppressed their sexuality as a survival mechanism after Christianisation and colonialisation. The powerful act of overruling the primary social relations of the Aboriginal community has remained post-colonialism, as dispossession has created ruptures and breaks in previous social structures, which in itself forms social experiences and cultural responses to these experiences, which is what we can see when we look at the social harm of the community. There is a side to the argument that sexual orientation and gender identity issues are not human rights issues, but I would like to argue that they are. Human rights have historically been disengaged from the struggles around ideas of sexuality and gender, despite the before-mentioned social, health, and harm issues. The constant reminder of self as other or different in relation to the larger culture causes people to feel marginalised, isolated, and disconnected. For this reason, the connection to the larger social group with shared experiences is particularly important. Group identity can also help individuals interpret and adaptively respond to the discrimination and prejudice they may encounter as members of marginalised groups, meaning that their experience is not inherently negative. The maintenance of Indigenous identities is also a process of decolonisation. For Indigenous peoples, preserving their material and spiritual relationship with their own cultural identity means protecting their lifestyle, their harmony with the universe, and their dignity as distinctive peoples. Transgender men Kai Clancy, explains what it means to belong to this minority. He said, "I thought it might have to sacrifice my culture just to be happy in my body, but that's not the case. Culture means the most to me. A lot of Aboriginal people feel that way. Acceptance in my own community is vital." The deprivation of Indigenous collective and individual existence means the loss of their cultural heritage. Seeing as Indigenous expressions of gender and sexuality are indeed part of their history, to erase these expressions would again erase Indigenous history. But by empowering the Indigenous LGBTI communities and telling stories of individual and collective experiences, we can reject all that has been distorted, erased, and altered to suit the needs of the colonizer. As the UN Special Rapporteur of the Rights of Indigenous People states, the factors which define Indigenous peoples' distinct identities as peoples, including traditional knowledge, language, and cultural expressions, should be safeguarded, developed, and protected by Indigenous peoples themselves. Therefore, self-determination of identity becomes incredibly important. Furthermore, including sexual orientation and gender identity-related rights presents us with the opportunity to reimagine human rights, which are more informed about what forms human identity and provides an insight from the bottom-up issues which people face. Therefore, diversifying human rights theories and keeping them relevant to the issues that people face today. Indigenous people have long had their own understandings of gender and sexuality, but colonialisation has forced them to engage with a new conceptualisation of the topic, thus repositioning their identities into an unfamiliar social discourse. As a result, the Indigenous LGBTI community have experienced disproportionate discrimination, prejudice, and dispossession, and have suffered from many ill, physical, social, and mental issues. Many of the issues that impacted the group go to the heart of human rights, including dignity for the individual, personal freedom, and bodily autonomy. Poor community understanding, a lack of cultural competency, and little visibility of distinct issues that affect the population have a direct flow on the impacts in legitimising institutional and interpersonal discrimination and restrict the provision of public services, including education and healthcare. Repairing Indigenous peoples' identity is imperative for all members of the international community, as it is a matter of cultural identity, human rights, and ultimately the physical survival of the peoples concerned. Especially in a group of people who have been historically dehumanized and dispossessed, sustaining and encouraging pride and identity in the Indigenous LGBTI community should be prioritized. Besides the moral duty to provide equality and dignity to all humans, it is also a matter of legal obligation under existing international law which Australia is bound to. Validating the identities of the Indigenous LGBT group is also an opportunity to redefine the norms of human rights and bring progressive change to Australia. Please find the references for this presentation below and feel free to contact me for any further information. I look very forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you so much for listening today.